Good evening, friends. We'd like to welcome you to what we believe is going to be a very rich conversation this evening with the Reverend Dr. Starsky Wilson, who is with us tonight. And we're so grateful that you have joined us this evening. Let me share with you just a little bit about the format of the evening. Dr. Wilson is going to give us an address for about 40 minutes, and then we will have an opportunity for you to have your questions answered. But as he speaks, would you feel free to enter your questions in the chat box? And we hope to get to as many of them as possible after his address. So we want you to relax and be welcomed into what I believe is going to be a very fruitful conversation this evening. Dr. Wilson, welcome. And I'm going to begin, if you don't mind, by just sharing an introduction so that those who don't know you will get a chance to learn a little bit about you in this way. Again, it is my pleasure to welcome the Reverend Dr. Starsky Wilson, the President and CEO of the Children's Defense Fund, to the YDS community and friends for what is the final conversation in the series entitled Transformational Leadership in a Turbulent Time. Dr. Wilson is a pastor, a philanthropist, and an activist pursuing God's vision of community, marked, as he believes, by justice, peace, and love. And we are grateful that he has come tonight to draw our attention to the most vulnerable members of our society, our children. And he comes well positioned to this task. He and his wife, Dr. Latoya Smith Wilson, a dentist for St. Louis Children's Hospital, are raising 4 children. And prior to this current assignment, Dr. Wilson served as the president and CEO of Deaconess Foundation, a faith-based grant-making organization supporting a movement for child well-being in St. Louis through philanthropy, advocacy, and organizing for racial equity and public policy change. Under Dr. Wilson's leadership, Deaconess constructed and established the Deaconess Center for Child Wellbeing, a 21,000 square foot community action tank. Each year, more than 15,000 citizens engage the center to build power for children and their families. Alongside its capacity building support for nonprofits, the foundation supports a network of congregation-based children's defense freedom schools. From 2008 to 2018, Dr. Wilson pastored St. John's Church, the Beloved Community as it is known, an interracial, intercity congregation affiliated with the United Church of Christ. While more than quadrupling the church's attendance and annual giving, he led activism on a myriad number of issues, expanding the church's witness by establishing the Beloved Community Conference that resources social justice ministries and Sojourner Truth, celebration of preaching women. After the police killing of Michael Brown Jr., with Dr. Wilson's leadership, the church hosted Black Lives Matter Freedom Ride to Ferguson and served as the welcome center for the Ferguson October. In service of community healing, he co-chaired the Ferguson Commission. And in 2015, they released the Forward Through Ferguson, a path towards racial equity report, calling for sweeping changes in policing, the courts, child well-being, and economic mobility. Dr. Wilson holds a master's degree in poli-sci from Xavier University, an MDiv from Eden Theological Seminary, and a DMin from Duke University. He has received various honorary degrees and served on numerous boards, including, to name a few, the National Committee for Responsible Philanthropy that he chairs, the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference, and the St. Louis Children's Hospital. Dr. Wilson, tonight our ears are open, for we remember that Jesus was unambiguous in his declaration that the one who embraces a child embraces him and the one who sent him. Children are at the very center of life in God's kingdom. So we are listening so that we might learn how to better amplify their voices so they may thrive. Dr. Wilson, our hearts are open, for we recognize that no leadership can be transformational unless it makes room for flourishing of each and every child. So friends, join me in listening tonight for what the Spirit might say to us through God's servant, the Reverend Dr. Starsky Wilson. Welcome.
Thank you so very much, Reverend Jennings. Thank you for this opportunity to share with this community and to be a part of this ongoing conversation that has included the voices of several whom I learned from. Reverend Tyler Sitt, Reverend Gabby, who's here in this conversation just last week. I'm grateful and honored to be a part of the continuum of conversation that is happening at Yale Divinity School, and for these who are friends gathered. I bring you greetings on behalf of the staff team of the Children's Defense Fund, our board, our volunteers, our partners across the country. And also, of course, in service to the 74 million children of this nation who indeed need your work, your practice, and your ministry in the interest and toward the vision of God's salvific work for all and transformative work for each and every one of them. Where you have left us off, I think I want to pick up for our conversation today. And because it's still Sunday, I do want to center a text for us. Although I will not preach, I will seek to reflect with us so that we might start a conversation about how we advance a vision of child well-being. And in order to do that, I think we need some pictures. And so I just want to paint a picture from a passage of scripture from the 10th chapter of Mark's gospel, the 13th through the 16th verses. I'll lift that up and then want to really reflect on the vision that the Children's Defense Fund is seeking to project and work toward for our nation in this particular moment as we consider this broader umbrella of conversation of transformational leadership for turbulent times. So the passage reads this way in the New Revised Standard Version of the text, and I learned much of scripture in my own Baptist roots and tradition, although I serve within the context of the United Church of Christ now, and I learned in Dallas, Texas, down in the South, and so every now and then I slip into the King James Version. I have to serve that disclaimer, but I'll try to stick here to the New Revised Standard. The passage is very familiar to you, I'm sure. People were bringing little children to him, to Jesus, in order that he might touch them. And the disciples spoke sternly to them. But when Jesus saw this, he was indignant and said to them, "Let the little children come to me." King James Version says, "Suffer the little children to come unto me, and forbid them not, for of such is the kingdom of heaven." The New Revised Standard says, "Let the little children come to me. Do not stop them, for it is to such as these that the kingdom of God belongs. Truly I tell you, whoever does not receive the kingdom of God as a little child will never enter it." And he took them up in his arms, see the picture, laid his hands on them, and blessed them. Considering the arc of conversation that you all have already been in, I didn't want to rehearse or rehash anything that had come before. I know because you sat in conversation with Reverend Tyler Sitt, my dear friend from there in Minneapolis, that you wrestled with the reckoning of racial justice and uprising that we experienced in 2020. I know you considered even the projection toward this moment where we wrestle with the realities of George Floyd's, the trial for Derek Chauvin, who killed George Floyd. I understand that you dealt with the reality of the transitions into a virtual environment for leaders of the church because of the pandemic. You had Pastor Gabby with you, and no one is better, quite frankly, wrestling with the virtual realities than the folks at the Double Love Experience. And so I know you have wrestled with the pandemic and all it has meant. I understand that you have already spent time unpacking the realities of last year's presidential election. And so rather than consider 2020, which we all know from the pandemic to the protests to the presidential election, for its turbulent temperature and times, I want us not to be confused that 2021 leaves us in a critical place as well. And so I want to begin with the beginning of this year. Indeed, as I came into this seat in leadership of the Children's Defense Fund in December of 2020, in 2021, as we began to extend the transition of our family to Washington, D.C. for the headquarters, and then keep also a home with family here where I am today in St. Louis, I decided that I didn't want to be alone in DC. And so my 12-year-old son, Dallas, who, by the way, has a birthday this week, came to live with me for the majority of our time in Washington, D.C. In fact, he came. On January 4th, we completed the drive, and he began to set up shop in his new room in our place in D.C., in as much as he left the rest of the family here in St. Louis. And over the course of those first 48 hours, we began to establish together our satellite home in Washington, D.C. And early into his time there, we began to wrestle with something. On January 6th, just before 11 a.m., the President of the United States at the time rallied his disappointed but determined supporters in the northwest section of Washington, D.C., at a rally promoted to, quote, save America from the results of a free and fair election. At the same time, on the northeast side of town, my son Dallas and I were shocked in the midst of our drive to begin to establish our satellite household. In the midst of this drive, we were shocked when an older, unhoused white gentleman fell faint and face first on the asphalt in front of my car. Seeing him convulsing and vulnerable from hitting his head, I positioned the vehicle to keep others from passing and joined two other men, aiding him by calling 911. It was a scary scene that I had wished this 12-year-old empath, this 12-year-old who holds emotion of others had not seen, but it wasn't the worst thing he saw that day. All of our children, home for virtual instruction, watched on television as violent anti-democratic white supremacists were allowed to storm and briefly occupy the US Capitol, just as they watched last summer as activists for racial justice were met with tear gas, rubber bullets, and arrested. Those events on January 6th, 48 hours into my 12-year-old son's move to the city, are clear examples of the existential threat and trauma of white supremacy to our children, to our country, and to the world. Images of the home of our legislature under siege by domestic terrorists signified the extent to which the future of our democracy and the future of its children is much more a contest over power than a principled debate about public policy. In this way, I found hope in the providential coincidence that those events unfolded on the same day that it was announced that my friend, the Reverend Dr. Raphael Warnock, pastor of Dr. King's Ebenezer Baptist Church, became the first Black senator elected from Georgia and only the 11th Black senator in our nation's history. Catapulted by impeccable character, years of preparation, and the work of faithful community organizers to build political power, His victory inspired hope for progress in the face of racialized resistance. But that day, January 6th violence reminded me that there is an immense mountain that we must still climb over. Hatred and racism that permeates our society and our political reality. That to build a world where marginalized and traumatized children flourish, leaders must prioritize their well-being. And this means countering and condemning, of course, the actions of people engaged in violence at the Capitol, continuing the pursuit of those who incited it, including that president, all of those who played some part in fomenting the resistance, including Josh Hawley, the junior senator from this state where I sit now, of Missouri, noting that they must all be held to account. Then we must also swiftly continue to work toward advancing a multiracial democracy that our children promote the promise for. Because our children, just like mine that day, are watching. They saw America, that older white gentleman dressed in a red jacket, blue jeans, long white socks soiled from sleeping outdoors, red, white, and blue, exposed and seething from blunt force trauma. They were traumatized and robbed of innocent belief in the idea of America. But they will remember those who called for help, who rushed in to aid, and who stood up to build power for their future at this moment where our very democracy continues to be at stake. What does that have to do with the text? What I see in the context of the text is a picture of the vision that we at the Children's Defense Fund believe is required in this moment to guard and to guide toward the picture of child well-being that we see in this image from the Christian tradition where Jesus holds in his arms children who are brought to him by desperate parents based upon their read of the state of Nazareth children in the moment where they find Jesus. What we're working toward at the Children's Defense Fund is indeed that which I have noted before, the vision of a nation where marginalized children flourish, where leaders prioritize their well-being, and communities wield the power to ensure that they thrive. Marginalized children. I have to tell you, as we began to inculcate this, integrate this, articulate this as our stated vision for CDF in January of this year, questions arose about marginalized children. Reverend, who are you talking about? And what does this mean for our commitment to all children? Here, we suggest two things. People hear two different things. Are you suggesting that you will only focus on Black and brown children, poor children only, those who are differently abled? Are you only going to focus on them? What does this mean for our universalist approach to all children? And then others suggest that we may also just be talking about the fact that children are marginalized in the political context and indeed in some of the parishional context of our service in America. All I'm really talking about is we got to start with a place of pain. As I consider this text in Mark's gospel, I understand that the Christian scriptures were formed, fomented, and canonized in the context of oppression of people. And so the only way to responsibly exegete any particular text that is rooted in the context of oppression is to begin with the pain of the people. And so I ask, in this text where Jesus gets so much shine for people in Christianity, in this text where the parents get some consideration because they are bum rushing Jesus, and this text where the disciples deserve a light on them because they are standing in the way between desperate people and Jesus, and while so much time in the Christian tradition wanting to apply all of this to ourselves, I want to know what's going on with the children, that the parents are so desperate that they want to bring their kids to be touched by this Afro-Asiatic Jewish brother marginalized from the wrong side of the tracks, not bringing him to the temple, maybe the temple already failed them, not bringing them to the government, maybe they have already failed, but something they read in the sense of child well-being on the countryside suggests that they should risk getting their children to Jesus, even over the objection of those who follow him. If we begin with the pain of the people and read it in our own times, we might seek to know a bit about what the Children's Defense Fund has been talking about for the last 2 weeks. On March 29th, we released to the public the State of America's Children 2021, a report that we have been producing for the last 30 years since its roots in the Black Community Crusade for Children, an era of renewal of our own mission. In that report, we find a few things. Number one, children represent 22% of the American population, and they continue to be the poorest segment of all Americans. Of course, like most things in America, this poverty is not equally distributed. Black and brown children find themselves more likely to be poor, more likely to live in malnourished circumstances, more deeply exposed to COVID-19 and its consequences. In fact, as of February 25th, 3.1 million children had caught COVID-19, at least reported cases. Representing 13.1% of all cases, our children are not immune. As we consider the research from the Center for Poverty and Social Policy at Columbia University, we see that since October 2020 analysis suggests that 8 million more Americans found themselves falling into poverty since May of 2020, and 2.5 million of them are children. And as of February of this year, more than 1 in 7 adults with children, about a little under 15%, reported that the children in their care were not getting enough to eat, more than 5 times the pre-pandemic rate. And so as we consider the state of marginalized children, and we consider the marginality of all children in our society, those like the ones in the text who have no voice, who have no vote, who own no property, who do not wield power that politicians have to react or respond to, and quite frankly, don't give enough tithes that pastors have to either. Then we must consider, in the State of America's Children, which I encourage you to go to childrensdefense.org and download, I invite you to consider in the context of your ministries and your preparation for ministry that perhaps the voices that are silenced, the voices that are most marginalized also carry the most promise if you and other leaders will prioritize their well-being. One of the reasons I like coming back to this particular text in Mark is because it models ministry for all of us. It considers for all of us who desire to be leaders, who consider ourselves leaders, and in that manner, consider ourselves servants. We see in Jesus an example of how we ought serve. Jesus decides to prioritize these desperate, marginalized children over not just the parents. He didn't say, let those parents come. Not just the disciples, who, by the way, some suggest are young people themselves, but these children who lived at the margins. Now, I know. The most difficult thing for any preacher to do in the context of a pericope or a parable, in the context of a text, is to get people to identify with Jesus. So that was a hard thing to do, to invite you to work with us to prioritize children like Jesus. I shouldn't have done that. What I will do, though, is say Jesus is a lens through which we see the full journey of leadership rooted, and I'll go then back to the First Testament. Dr. Marty Stevens, in her consideration of leadership in the Old Testament, sees 4 different modes of leadership: priest, prophet, king, and sage. I appreciate them because as we apply them, we suggest that it's not just about what policymakers can do, what legislators should do, what the president should do. The matter of the care of children is the responsibility of people who wear different types of hats. Yes, elders should be telling us stories and teaching us about the power of children. I appreciate through CDF being able to sit down at the feet of Reverend James Lawson, Marion Wright Edelman, and Taylor Branch, and hear about the power of the Children's Crusade in the context of the contemporary civil rights movement. And I recognize the value and the power of those who wear the moniker of the king, who are charged with developing legislation for how we order our economic and social lives together. And it's their responsibility to advance things like the expansion of the child tax credit and the earned income tax credit that we found in the American Rescue Plan, and to keep fighting for a $15 minimum wage like we called for 2 years ago in our End Child Poverty Now report. These are critical things for the sages and the kings to do, but it also work for prophets and priests to do. And I would suggest that there are not a small number of those who have chimed in today who may identify in these categories. The prophets, by this I mean those who have a word for the circumstance, who have the capacity to rally the people to do something about it. I'm talking about community activists and organizers. I'm talking about people who are engaged in power building, because part of the problem, I'll tell you, I have found in the context of my work on behalf of children is that those who are doing child advocacy work are not doing a good job of building power, and those who are building power in community organizing don't talk enough about our children. And there is work for those to do. When we talk about leaders prioritizing children's well-being, we're not just talking about what legislators ought to do in Washington, D.C. or capitals across the country. We're talking about what the prophets should be doing in the context of communities and their organizing. But we're not going to leave the priests out. I am talking to folks at Yale Divinity School and its wider network. There is a responsibility to prioritize children in the context of the priestly work of caring for the people. One of the most difficult moments of mentoring in ministry for me was having to counsel and consult with a pastor who was my elder, but we counseled with one another with mutuality over the difficulty she experienced with the closure of her church after a resurrection service. In that service, the church was full and packed with family members of a child that was being baptized. And while she understood and appreciated them coming, she also wrestled with the fact that had they been coming all along, had this family been engaged all along in the life and ministry of the church, then maybe that wouldn't have been the church's last service. And I was trying to be kind, and I was working to be supportive, and I was trying to be encouraging, but I wondered and I wrestled with the idea, well, if you totally reorganize everything you did in the life of your ministry, your parish, your congregation, and your church around that child, then maybe the church would be full. I know I pastored for 10 years. I was a youth pastor before that.Maybe I carry that prejudice with me today. But I wonder what it would be like if the priests in the context of our congregation centered and prioritized children's well-being rather than seeing them to be an addendum to the family that ought to be cared for. I'm not going to leave out other policymakers. There are also those in the corporate realm who are leaders who need to advance and prioritize children's well-being. I was glad just last week to be able to stand as an inaugural partner, Children's Defense Fund and 9 other organizations working across our various sectors in the corporate sector and the philanthropic sector with the Robin Hood Foundation and Starbucks and the ACLU and Harvard's Chan School of Public Health to say we need to reduce the inequity in racial wealth. The racial wealth gap in America suggests that Black children grow up in families that have 10 times less wealth than white children. And if leaders will prioritize their well-being in the corporate realm, it will take a collective action, and we must do things like investing deposits from major corporations in Black depository institutions. We must make sure that we're investing with Black investment managers. And this has critical impact on the well-being of children because we recognize that income and wealth has critical advancement capacity for well-being. Leaders must prioritize their well-being, whether they are sages, kings, prophets, or priests. You might not identify with Jesus, but maybe with some of those. And finally, our vision suggests that we only get to the nation that we deserve and desire. We can only react and respond to the end of innocence in America from January 6th in the eyes of our children if communities wield the power to ensure that they thrive. Now, I'm going to tell you, I like dealing with the reality of the children in the text. And I enjoy focusing on Jesus and how he models leadership that prioritizes children in the context of the text. But I wish something else happened. I wish Jesus didn't have to tell the disciples to get out of the parents' way, because I wish the parents overtook the disciples in the context of the text. I wish they had the excitement and the authority and the power that was stirred up in them, that before Jesus said anything, they overcame the barrier on their own and broke their way into Jesus, because that expression of power is something that we are reticent to wrestle with in our context. Communities engaging in the work around children is part of the project that CDF planted when it started something called CDF Freedom Schools, bringing people together around a culturally relevant pedagogy so that children had an alternative to the educational models that they saw in their schools, which, by the way, they are reacting to negatively. The achievement gap may not be something that the children can't do. The opportunity gap may actually be the children reacting to a system of education that wasn't built for them in the first place. But that's another sermon for another Sunday. What I really want to point to is this idea that CDF Freedom Schools are a project of parents and community members and churches coming together to get a sense of what's going on with children, and then they begin to work that out to create the circumstances whereby those children can thrive. And one of the things that we need to do to make sure communities have that power is to react and to respond to electoral justice in our communities. What's going on in Georgia, what's going on in Texas, what's going on in Missouri, what's going on in Ohio, these reactions and responses to quell protests by increasing the capacity to hold protesters accountable and quash them, and also to restrict the ballot from Black and brown communities is something that we must fight against if we care. Somebody once said, my dear brother Joe Goldman, the president and CEO of the Democracy Fund, when he came to speak at Deaconess Center for Child Wellbeing 2 years ago, he told people in the community, and I say it to you, if you care about justice, you better fight for democracy. If you care about child well-being and circumstances being transformed, then we have to protect the ballot for Black and brown mamas and grandmamas, who are the people who elected our dear brother Raphael Warnock. If we care about making sure that children keep their increased SNAP benefits that came through American Rescue Plan, then we have to make sure that people have access to the ballot in all of our states. Communities must wield the power to ensure that these children thrive. We work toward a vision of a nation where marginalized children flourish, where leaders prioritize their well-being, and where communities wield the power to ensure they thrive. Because we believe this, and I'm done, we believe that child well-being is both gospel and resurrection. Every year, the Children's Defense Fund hosts faith leaders, advocates, and organizers at Haley Farm in Tennessee for a week of renewal, worship, and skill building. 2016, I organized a delegation from St. Louis, including youth leaders and children from St. John's Church, the beloved community where I served as pastor at the time. During one of the breaks between the afternoon workshops and the nighttime chapel, the adults from our group went inside while the kids from the congregation joined new friends playing on the front lawn of a building called the Wright House. This is the last guest house built by historian Alex Haley, who lived on the property, and had been renamed to honor the family of our founder, Marion Wright Edelman. Confused by its gleaming, snowy exterior, contrasted to a green roof and window shutters, my youngest son, Mason, who was 5 years old at the time, called it the White House. As the children played, Reverend Dr. John Kinney, then Senior Vice President and Dean of the Proctor School of Theology at Virginia Union University, arrived for his evening preaching assignment. On the drive down the gravel road through the campus to the lodge at the far end, Dr. Kinney was welcomed by the sounds and the scene of children laughing, running, and even a little dancing. The image stuck with him. So much so that that evening, when this stalwart of the Black church tradition and the pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church in Beaver Dam, Virginia, stood to preach the good news, he painted the picture of children, those children, my children, our church's children, playing on the lawn, running with reckless abandon, giggling with bursting joy, dancing in open air like nobody's watching. Those are signs that children are well. In fact, they are signs that our communities are well, that our nation is doing well. Our kids could play without reservation on the farm because they were safe, they were healthy and well nourished. There were adults nearby, thoughtfully from the church and in the White House, working actively to build a better world for them to thrive. This farm is a carefully crafted space for children to flourish and for people to be renewed. But this doesn't have to stop on a campus in Tennessee. Marginalized children flourish when leaders prioritize their well-being and communities wield the power to ensure they thrive. We all experience resurrection. This is the hope-filled picture of a new day arising. And after a pandemic season of Good Fridays marked by loss, mourning, and death, and the extended silence of public policy to our protests in recent Holy Saturdays, our nation needs a word of resurrection. And every time a child smiles, God's word is proclaimed. Like the resurrection we prepared for in Lent and celebrate during this Eastertide, appearance narratives are required to remind us that new life is possible, to sustain our strength on the journey to justice. Every now and then, God gives us a glimpse of the world we are working for. These images radicalize our work. They remind us that we wrestle not against any lobby or ism, but for a new life in a world where children thrive. It is already, just not yet. And we look forward to making it manifest with each and every one of you. God bless you. I look forward to talking and learning as we engage with one another.
Thank you so much for painting that picture for us, specifically the one in Tennessee. It gives us a visual to remind us of what we're called to create through whether we're a prophet, a priest, or whatever role we find ourselves in. And we have a few questions that I'm going to share with you. The first is this: the care of children is the responsibility of people who wear different types of hats. Some develop legislation, some teach. There is, of course, work for the prophets and the priests, those who have the capacity to rally the people. Would you give some examples of some in society who are doing this?
Sure, I'm glad to, and I'm also careful. You know, I spent part of my life as a fundraiser around major gifts, and one of the rules we had was you never name something after somebody who's still living because you don't know what they're going to do tomorrow. So I just want to date stamp. I want to date stamp these reflections. I've already named some of the elders that I think are really critical for us to learn from. It is not lost on me that in my journey, even before I came on staff at CDF, that the place where I came to rub elbows and to listen deeply and sit at the feet of a Marian Wright Edelman and a James Lawson and a Taylor Branch and others from the movements, the National Council of Elders and others, was at Alex Haley Farm. And so when I say what are the elders are telling us the stories and giving us the wisdom, and so I point to them as models. As I consider legislators and those who are advancing work, I'm very pleased to be partnered in advancing with folks like Congresswoman DeLauro and Delbini and Richie Torres from New York, the American Family Act, which will take the expansion of the child tax credit that was in the American Rescue Plan and make it permanent. And on the Senate side, I should say, should give credit to Senators Booker, Bennett, and Brown, Sherrod Brown, Michael Bennett and Cory Booker, who are working to make that happen from the Senate side. So as we consider those with that hat of the king, that's critical work. As we talk about those who are working as in this priestly role, I have been in the same way brought to tears, quite frankly, by the really thoughtful work that the Reverend Dr. Otis Moss III has been doing at Trinity United Church of Christ in Chicago, and some of that work that he brings down to the farm to help lead and guide and provide models for many of us in ministry. But there are also many folks whose names don't get called at these spaces and places. I think about Reverend Dana Purdom, who is active in our Proctor network, works down in the Carolinas and continues to encourage and support advance, providing reflection and context in lots of different settings. So I think we have people in these various modes, and it's not lost on me. The final thing, people miss things because of the headlines when we talk about legislation. A few years ago, or just a couple of years ago, we were talking about the Breathe Act coming forth from the Movement for Black Lives, a comprehensive legislation on behalf of this movement, but it had in it very well-crafted child welfare and foster and adoptive care legislation. So as we consider those who are doing the prophetic work, we also know that there are people who are paying attention to children's issues. And so I'll point to those examples with this date stamp and suggest that there's so many more that we just don't have time to go for. But it's kind of like the civil rights movement. You talk to anybody who is alive during the civil rights movement, or those who are their children, it seemed like everybody was marching with King. But those who study it recognize that he was in the minority, and indeed, he was in an unpopular position that got him essentially kicked out of the National Baptist Convention, such that there was the need to found the Progressive National Baptist Convention, who first gave me ordination papers. So let's be clear, while there are many examples, there are not enough, and there's much work for us to do.
Thank you. I have another question for you. I hear you challenging divinity school students to prioritize the need to centralize children. Do you have any thoughts about how to do that early in our ministries when it seems like others are ready to tell us where our focus should be?
Yeah, so I'll join the community of people telling you where your focus should be. Um, um, First and foremost, I mean, I think a lot of those first jobs for people out of, at least out of independent seminaries, perhaps not as much so out of divinity schools, tend to be care and feeding, orienting around children. Perhaps you're like me, my first of ordained ministry, first 6 years of ordained ministry, whereas a youth pastor. So the question may be, how does one understand the need to radicalize that work? Not just as care and feeding of those who are right in front of us, but understand that to be, again, for those who read an assessment of the disciples and suggest that when Jesus goes into the temple, he only provides and only needs to provide a sacrifice for 2 adults. So maybe Peter is the only one who's of age. So maybe all of the disciples are a youth group. How do we understand that ministry first? As radical work, understand Jesus as a youth pastor and begin to model that. And understanding that, starting with pain, with the pain and the proximity of those young people, but chasing it through, like finishing the work to map it to policies that create that pain and powers that are responsible for that policy. And so I invite us that if that's the place where we find ourselves, let's just make sure we drop our bucket deeply enough that we're doing something beyond the Christian education curriculum, which, by the way, always, anywhere you go, needs to be transformed as well. The other thing I'll say is that for those who will do research, there is work here to do. Someone who is not unfamiliar with Yale Divinity School, my dear sister, Carrie Day, Dr. Carrie Day, has wrestled with me in conversation about, and we have, freedom dreamed a little bit together about the fact that there is need for a children's liberation theology. That there is work, there's a body of work for us to do around the liberation of children in their freedom and situation in the eyes of God in a radical context, in a radically inclusive context for their own purpose. And so in as much as we advance these theologies for various communities, there is work to be done there that perhaps the enterprising theologian on this call is called to as well.
Thank you. I have another question for you, but I'm so grateful that you invited students to think about that because the church very often loses children under the rubric of youth.
Yes. Yes.
We have a question here that says, how might CDF address, or is it addressing, the widespread impact of trauma on children and adolescents?
Yeah, this is something that we are both engaging to learn and seeking to lead on. And I think that's an appropriate reflection point always. As a matter of fact, this week we're going to be engaging with a group called the Children's Institute. I encourage you to go to their website, Google the Children's Institute this week. They are having a Trauma Informed Care Institute where we'll be one of the speakers. So we'll be learning there in that context about ways to engage and integrate into our supports and services for young people. So our Freedom Schools, I'll say for a number of years, those who are practicing in our Children's Defense Fund Freedom Schools receive as a part of their training as servant leaders, as part of their training as executive directors, and as a part of their training as site coordinators, some consideration of and training in trauma-informed care. So we've been pleased to be engaging that for our direct service work for some time. Secondarily, we're also continuing to advance supportive legislation around mental health for young people, both in schools and wraparound services and supports. We continue to advocate and receive some support in the COVID relief bill, the second COVID relief bill, for mental health services and wraparound services for unhoused young people who are wrestling with the trauma of that, but wraparound services for all young people in public schools. And we are glad to see even more focus on the care economy in the American Jobs Plan that has been proposed. So in our program and our policy, we're attending to both of those. But I think more than anything else, I want to point to this critical matter of our continued learning and encourage people, if you can, to be with us this week in this conversation with the Children's Institute and leaders and conversation partners like Dr. Ibram Kendi, who will be one of the keynotes and will be one of the panel and plenary speakers as well, talking and learning about how we integrate responses to trauma in all of our work. The last thing I'll say, as we're preparing for, and I've mentioned Alex Haley Farm before, the reality is we are all experiencing trauma, especially over the course of the pandemic. And as one of my kind of mentors in the philanthropic space has suggested to me, coming out of this, we're all going to need a healing space, and we're all going to need healing work. So I want to encourage that, for us, Alex Haley Farm is a healing space. It is a place of renewal. And the curation and reopening of that space for us post-pandemic will also be a way that we engage in healing ministry, create space for others to be engaged in reflection and renewal and rejuvenation on their own.
Thank you. I have a further comment along these lines, and that is, what do you think is the most important thing clergy and congregations can now do to be proactive in addressing this kind of trauma that may lead now to our children experiencing more suspensions, more challenges in their academic accomplishments, and especially given this question is that mental health and emotional health care is often still stigmatized in our communities?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things we need to do. I appreciate the frame that Becky Pringle, the president of the National Education Association, puts on kind of what we're wrestling with when we talk about school reopening. And she talks about not learning loss, but COVID impact, right? What has been the overall impact of COVID-19? There will indeed be learning loss. And there will be a social, we must think about the social isolation that has been experienced by children, and particularly Black children. In December of 2019, the Congressional Black Caucus released a paper talking about the spike in suicide for Black children. So we were already dealing with a pandemic increase of suicides among Black and Brown children and youth, and particularly Black children. And then we came into a space of 2020 that included disorientation of routine, which children need, that included social isolation from not being able to engage in classrooms, included more of the screen time that we knew was challenging for their mental health. But now there's more of it because it's the only means by which they can communicate with others. So these are all impacts. So I want to say a couple of things. Number one, that is going to require a full reorientation of the children in your life, which I encourage you to start with, for those you deeply care about. Know that we will require a full reorientation for those children, a resocialization to the classroom context, a reopening and reconsideration of out of school time supports like freedom schools and other after school and summer school programs in order to react to the learning loss, and some additional support from a youth development and a mental health standpoint. So part of what you can do is number one, many of your municipalities have already received a number of allocation for what their COVID relief will be based upon the American Rescue Plan. For our community here, again, I'm sitting in St. Louis. We've got these two homes going right now as we transition. It'll be just over $500 million, right? And so there are billions of dollars, millions of dollars that are coming into your community that should be reacting and responding, and your local elected officials need to come up with a plan for how they will be used. I encourage you, advocate for the investment in public health and specifically mental health supports for children and youth as those dollars come. Second, be sure that your schools are utilizing the investments of additional wraparound services and supports that came from the American Rescue Plan to provide mental health services for young people. So this is a unique opportunity of those investments as well to make sure that we supplement the really challenging approach to repayment of services that we have for mental health. And so these are things that can be done. And finally, the school hours will not be enough for your school children when they go back. And so being intentional to create opportunities outside of school time with personal time, whether that's additional play dates, that's additional out of school time, people, having your house open to other young people, or whether it's structured programming. The resocialization is something that's going to be required for mental health support for young people as well. It's, two questions. I wasn't supposed to be in St. Louis this week. Since my son came to be with me in DC, we've decided we would balance. We've spent 3 weeks in DC and 1 week in St. Louis. And it wasn't my time to be in St. Louis. But this week, my 5-year-old who started public school on Zoom in the context of COVID came to my wife and asked her, she said, I have 2 questions. I said, okay, 5 years old. I have 2 questions. When am I going back to the building to be with my classmates? And when is my daddy coming home? I drove 12 hours, got here this afternoon. I can't get her back in the building, but she was asking about her social environment and when she was going to get it back. Your children may not have said it with that same articulation, but your children are asking for it. Your neighbors' children are asking for it. Your church kids are asking for it. So please, ma'am, please, sir, invest deeply in their resocialization and reorientation, because that's what we can do beyond policy, before policy, to care for their mental health.
Thank you for those very practical guidance for us that anybody can really do in whatever community we find ourselves, is to be attentive to children. Even if we find them in the grocery store, we can certainly make space to acknowledge them and acknowledge their need. There is a question that we have, which is a little bit of a broader question. So I'm going to share that with you. And then we have time for one more question, I think. This question, it centers around something you spoke about earlier. Would you talk a little bit more about the idea of an effective multiracial democracy? Who would lead it? And who has that kind of vision that we await?
Yeah, I was really excited in January of this year to be a part of the kickoff of a project called American Transformation, the American Transformation Project, with our partners at Urban Institute. I encourage you to go to Urban Institute, American Transformation Project, led by Dr. Faith Mitchell. And in that, what we were talking about was that Generation Z, so the combination of these young people under the age of 18 and the 73 million, 74 million young people under the age of 18, another 30 million under the age of 25. So that is the largest generation of the American population and the most diverse ever. So it is by consequence, because if it is the case that one person gets one vote, if one person gets one vote, and this is the rising majority in America, and this is the most diverse generation, and in 2020, I didn't say that. I can't believe I didn't say this before. I always say this. While we were paying attention to the pandemic and to the presidential election, to the protests in 2020, U.S. Census Bureau projected that it was the first year in American history that the majority of children under the age of 18 were children of color. To speak of children in America is to speak of people of color. To speak of racial justice sustainably means you have to talk about child well-being, and to speak of child well-being means you have to be talking. Why do I mention this in this way in the context of this question? Because what it means is this will be the generation that finally completes the project of what America has been selling as its identity: multiracial democracy. Effective, consistent, and sustainable multiracial democracy is a project that is still young on the global stage, young in the global context. And scholars who take it seriously suggest that even America is young, because we didn't start the project of multiracial democracy until the 1960s. We weren't trying to make sure everybody was included until the 1960s. So we're still young on this project. But the promise of the demographics of Generation Z suggests that they would be to only the whitest parts of town and the oldest part of the population, then we won't get there. But if we will protect the franchise and allow it to be the inheritance of these children who are coming across the age of 18, who in the last few years in Generation Z started coming into our workforce, then that's who will lead a multiracial democracy. And it will look very different. It will be guided by different mores and values, those that are pulled together by the cultures that nurture these children. And so I'm excited about that. But it has to be defended, because one person, one vote worked in the rhetorical parlance until we started to see Black and brown people exercising at levels like we did in the last election, where we saw the highest turnout ever in a presidential election. Then we started needing to constrain it for whatever reason. I'll stop there. Yeah, one more question.
Thank you. I don't have another question, and we actually have come to the end of our time, but I think it's a wonderful way in which we've ended, because you've also given us yet another picture, not just the picture up in Tennessee, but the picture of this new generation rising, and a generation that is already multiracial and full of diversity that can, in fact, bring to a reality the very thing that this country says it wants to be. So I thank you so much for coming tonight and for reminding us of how critical our role can be in shaping and caring for our children, all of them, and each of them.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. Great to be with you. And thank you for this series. Lots of learning for me and for others. And I look forward to going back through all other conversations that I didn't get a chance to see yet, but I saw some and I already took my notes. So I look forward to continuing to engage.
Oh, thank you so much again. And we look forward to reviewing. You gave us lots of things to refer to, which we will have an opportunity to look toward engaging in the future. And let's see if, in fact, Yale is the place out of which you find a young theologian creating for us a child liberation theology.
Yes, let it be so.
Thank you. Have a wonderful night, and be sure you take your 5-year-old to school into the building.
Bless you. Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.